Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So this is going to be a solution walkthrough video to the second exam in a Principles of Microeconomics course. So it's basically a variety of topics starting with welfare economics, so consumer and producer surplus, then thinking about gains from trade, comparative advantage, absolute advantage, into international trade, then externalities, positive and negative externalities, public goods, common resources, and then finally labor markets. So same with all solution walkthrough videos. What I'll do is I'll display all the questions. Sorry, it's not like typeset perfectly because I didn't open up the file in like the usual PDF because I wanted to be able to amend it if like I want to add to my answer or something. But anyway, so it should probably be fine. You can take screen captures or whatever. I never say this, but I should mention if you find like this content useful, it's good if you like and subscribe. That way it really helps the algorithm. It helps like other students also benefit, but most importantly, also helps my motivation to make more videos and content if I like realize that it actually is beneficial, because there's like definitely an opportunity cost of my time. So, all right, there's 40 questions total. So here's the last couple pages. They're all multiple choice. I had a longer form question I wanted to put on the exam, and then the exam is timed at 75 minutes, and I was a little bit worried that if I had a longer form question that could actually eat up a lot of time. Okay, so first question, higher wages for accountants will cause demand for accountants to increase? Nope. Things that'll cause demand for accountants to increase are basically things that are going to affect the marginal revenue product of accountants. So it's going to be the price of the things the accountants are performing, like the output market, and then the marginal product, marginal productivity. Those two multiplied together gives us the marginal revenue product. That's the labor demand curve. That's not affected here. Existing accountants will work fewer hours. Well, I mean, maybe, but we'd have to make assumptions about income effect and substitution effect. The more natural answer is some people have switched jobs to become accountants. We could think of this as a change in the price of, or change in the wage of one career, which is a labor supply shifter in the market from other jobs. And so people will switch jobs to become accountants. Fewer people seek jobs as accountants? Yeah, probably not. All right, so the second one, Eliana and Olivia are at Barnes & Noble buying new calculators for the semester. Let's see, E is willing to pay, or marginal benefit is 80. Olivia is willing to pay, marginal benefit is 75. Price of the calculator is 55. What's E's individual consumer surplus? Oh, it's just 25. So it's marginal benefit, or willingness to pay, minus the price. This is the definition of individual consumer surplus, and then would stretch that out across all units purchased, graphically being the area under the demand curve and above the price, which would typically be calculated as the area of a triangle, kind of depending on what other things might be going on, would be overall consumer surplus. So we didn't ask that here. Here I was just asking for individual consumer surplus. Because the general market mechanism does not take into account the side effects that harm bystanders, so externalities, a market economy will produce too much pollution without government regulation. So the idea is if you ignore the negative externality, you get overproduction of whatever is the primary activity that generates the externality, the spillovers to bystanders. So if there's a negative externality, you get overproduction. If there's a positive externality, you get underproduction when the market's left to its own devices. So if there's like a corrective tax or subsidy, then we can get the decision makers to internalize the externality. But otherwise, which I mentioned here, but otherwise that's not going to happen. We'll get the market equilibrium, which will have too much pollution. That's as measured relative to what would be the socially efficient equilibrium. All right, so your state funds the development of an efficient and inexpensive to use public transportation system in your city. What will that do to the equilibrium, employment, and the competitive ride sharing market? Well, this is going to be a viable substitute to ride sharing. So this is probably replacing short rides that people might otherwise fill with Uber or Lyft or taxi or something like that. Now, if we have this inexpensive, efficient public transportation system, there's going to be a decrease in demand for ride shares. So therefore, there's going to be a decrease in demand for the labor of the drivers rendering those ride shares. So we'd expect fewer jobs for rideshare drivers. So A is the best answer. You're considering whether to expand your 3D printed ornaments business to the international market. If you do not engage in trade, blank determines the domestic market output. with trade, blank determines the domestic market output. And so what we're interested in doing is we're thinking about how does the domestic market output change when we go between trade and no trade? And also we have to remember what's going to measure domestic market output. It's going to be the quantity supplied from the domestic supply curve. So we're going to be interested in where does the domestic market supply curve cross the demand curve originally? That's the situation with no trade. And then where does the domestic market supply curve cross the world price? That'll give us the domestic quantity supplied. So the best answer here is A. Your classmate is both a better writer and a better proofreader. Well, okay, so they've got an absolute advantage. However, although they are much better at proofreading, they're only a little better at writing. In other words, they have an absolute advantage in both tasks and a comparative advantage in proofreading, but you have a comparative advantage in writing. I think maybe sometimes it can help to make a numerical example that's somewhat consistent with this, and maybe you can kind of envision it. So I say A is much better, so it has an absolute advantage in both, but you have a CA, comparative advantage, in writing. So here's an example. It takes A 1 minute to proofread, 1 minute to write. Okay, it takes you 4 minutes to proofread, so they're much faster, and 2 minutes to write, so they're much faster, but they're only a little bit faster at writing. Okay, if we calculate opportunity costs, when you spend 2 minutes writing, that is the time requirement necessary to do half of what we've determined to be the proofreading task. But for Aaliyah, 2 minutes spent writing costs actually 2 proofreading tasks. So they have a higher opportunity cost of writing in terms of foregone proofreading, which means you have the lower opportunity cost for writing, so you have the comparative advantage in writing. Okay, so 7. So suppose we get a promotion, comes with an increase in annual salary. Labor supply curve will be blank. If the substitution effect is blank, then the income effect. So if the substitution effect is dominant, then the labor supply curve just looks like an ordinary supply curve. It's just like upward sloping. And so I said, if the substitution effect is dominant, meaning if the substitution effect is greater than the income effect, if the income effect was greater, then the labor supply curve looks like a demand curve. It's going to be downward sloping. And then putting it all together, for an individual, you might have this backward bending labor supply curve, where at low levels, it's going to be initially upward sloping, then it's going to be vertical, and then at high levels, high wages, it'll be backward bending. And I just say this is true by definition. Yeah, that's kind of the definition of the labor supply curve, the relationship between substitution effect and income effect. Though I think maybe my explanation just now is probably more satisfactory than just what I wrote there. All right, so if extra output produced by hiring one more unit of labor adds more to blank than to blank, the firm will increase its profit by increasing the use of labor. The answer here is if the extra output adds more to total revenue than to total cost, you increase profit by increasing use of labor. You might have accidentally wanted to say, so adds more to marginal revenue than to marginal cost. Now, fortunately, for those who might have been misled, I did not order them in, if I would have flipped these, then that would have been like a serious conversation. Except that's my explanation here. We're not exploring how marginal revenue and marginal cost are themselves changing when we're interested in hiring one more, the incremental step. We're interested in how is total revenue and total cost changing. And that's measured by the derivative of the total cost and total revenue functions. If you don't have calculus, that's okay. We just call that derivative marginal revenue and marginal cost, which is what this is. But we're interested in how total revenue and total cost is changing. That's why B is the right answer. And like I said, if I had swapped this, then I think a lot more people would be misled, which is exactly why I didn't. Right? I wanted the question to be a little bit tricky, but not unnecessarily tricky. Okay, the government increases training requirements to obtain an electrician's license. What impact will this have on the labor market for electricians? Well, if you increase the training requirements, it's going to make it more difficult to enter this industry. And so we're going to decrease the labor supply. So I say the supply of electricians will decrease, resulting in a higher wage, lower quantity of labor. That's just by definition of what happens when labor supply shifts leftward. Higher wage, smaller quantity. All right, number 10. the table provides data on how long it takes Marla and Jason to cook lasagna and chicken curry. M's opportunity cost of making lasagna is blank, and J's opportunity cost is blank. All right, so the way to calculate this, here, look at the table and see what we have. We're given hours to cook lasagna and chicken curry, and this is, I mean, the way that I've got this, actually, I kind of regret how this moved a little bit, so sorry about that. What I've wrote down here is correct. In 4 hours, M can make one lasagna, right? So this is 4 hours, M can make one lasagna, or can make 1.3 chicken. So that was this 3 right here, and so you divide divide 3 by, what was this? 3 by, 4 hours, and it takes 3 hours to make chicken curry, and so 4 hours is 33% more than you'd need for the 3 hours necessary to make chicken curry. So that's why in 4 hours, M can make 1 L or 1.3 chicken curry. So this 4 goes here. I should just fix this. Like I said, okay. So I wanted to use the word processing document so I can make this look the way that it's supposed to. Maybe this will kind of clarify a little bit better. Sorry I didn't catch this before. Okay. In 3 hours, J can make 1 lasagna or 3 chicken, because 3 hours is the time it takes to make lasagna, so you can get 1. But if you have those 3 hours, it only takes 1 hour to make a chicken curry, so you can have 3 of those. Okay, so based on this, we see the 1.3 chicken curries and 3 chicken curries for each of these, for each of them respectively. Who has the lowest opportunity cost? M. So M has the comparative advantage in L, in lasagna. Jason's opportunity cost is higher for making lasagna, 3 versus 1.33. Jason would have the comparative advantage in making chicken curry. And if we flip these, would be given up fewer lasagnas for each chicken curry. All right, so the marginal external cost, by definition, that's the externality. That's a negative externality. So I say true by definition, the external cost imposed by bystanders of 1 unit of the output. See, I'm getting thrown off because I see my camera's like freezing, and I don't know if I'm assuming it's going to be okay. But all right, so price minus marginal cost equals producer surplus. That's definition of producer surplus. Corrective tax designed to resolve a negative externality problem is typically set at an amount equal to the marginal external cost. So if we want to correct for an externality, we want to set the tax equal to exactly the marginal external cost. And then what that's going to do is, remember, the whole problem with the negative externality is that from the perspective of decision makers, this harm caused by their production that's imposed on bystanders, it's non-salient, meaning it's difficult for them to be aware of it, and it's almost impossible to quantify. So they don't know exactly how large the problem is and or how much to reduce their behavior or reduce their output to reduce the externality. However, if we give them this tax, then they can behave as if they're paying attention to the externality, because the tax will proxy for the external harm. And that's why we say it will internalize the externality. All right, Jorge sells a hammock for $85. His marginal cost for one hammock is $40. Average cost is $50. What is the producer surplus for the sale of one hammock? All right, so producer surplus is going to be the price minus cost. Well, which cost? Marginal cost, right? Because marginal cost is going to be the cost associated with selling that unit. So it's going to be 85 minus 40 is 45. We're using marginal cost. Another way to do that, or to know that it's marginal cost and not average cost, is, remember, if we're calculating producer surplus, it's the area under the price and above the supply curve. Well, supply curve is the marginal cost curve, because we say the theory of supply is the theory of marginal cost. So that's another way to see why it should be marginal cost and not average cost. All right, so if the number of available cap and trade permits falls, the equilibrium price of permits blank and the equilibrium quantity of emissions blank. Well, if permits are more scarce, we can think of a reduction in supply of cap and trade permits. As a result, prices should rise, quantity should fall, right? Right. So suppose the local grocery chain is able to gain cheaper access to AI and finds applications for new technology throughout the entire company. All right, so this is supposed to be pretty influential in its hiring decision. At the same time, the government implements a program of universal basic income that provides everyone in the country enough income to cover their basic living expenses. So what impact do we expect on the equilibrium wage and quantity in the labor market for grocery workers? All right, so the labor demand side, it's not quite clear because we have this change in the price of technology, which could either give rise to a substitution effect where the AI substitutes and replaces workers, or a scale effect. Basically, you could think of the scale effect as the AI actually being a complement to workers. So we might hire more workers, or it might allow the grocery store to expand the scale of its operation, maybe open new stores or something, and then hire more workers as a result. And so it's basically scale effect or substitution effect is asking the question of, are workers in technology complements or substitutes? So I'll go through that here. Then there's a labor supply effect, and the effect of the universal basic income. Well, since everyone in the country has enough income to cover their basic living expenses, we're going to expect there's going to be a decrease in labor supply because there's going to be people who are taking jobs to cover their basic needs who no longer need to, and so when they're covered by this program, then they leave the labor force, and so as a result, the wages rise for those who remain is the idea. All right, so on the labor demand side, we'd expect an increase in labor demand if there's a scale effect. So if cheaper AI means we'll use more technology and hire more workers because they're complements, that's an increase in demand. So rightward shift the labor demand curve, higher wage, higher quantity. But if AI and then workers are substitutes, we'll get a leftward shift of the labor demand curve. As a result, wages and quantity both fall. The labor supply change is going to just be a leftward shift, as we said. Wage is going to rise, quantity is going to fall. The best answer is D. The wage will for sure rise if the scale effect dominates, and the quantity could rise or fall. And basically, all we have to do is look over these four options and then grab the two combinations and then make sure that they match with what it says right here. And the best answer is D. Wages will rise and quantity could rise or fall if the scale effect dominates. Because if the scale effect dominates, wages are going to rise, but wages rise because of this labor supply decrease. But the scale effect, the demand side is saying quantity should rise. The supply effect is telling us quantity should fall. That's why we say it could rise or fall. In other words, it could be the effect on quantity is ambiguous or indeterminate. All right, so if Canada can produce 30 tablets for every car and Malaysia can produce 15 tablets for every car it produces, Malaysia has the comparative advantage in car production. So we can't say anything about absolute advantage actually, because this is phrasing tablets in terms of cars, and we don't know exactly what those numbers are. So it's difficult to say much about absolute advantage, but we can say something about comparative advantage. And basically, we know how many tablets each gives up to produce one car. Malaysia gives up fewer tablets, and so by definition, that's comparative advantage. If the market output is not efficient, which is true, economic surplus is not maximized. So when the market's efficient, we maximize economic surplus. That happens at the competitive equilibrium, assuming that there's no causes of market failure, such as monopoly power, externalities, asymmetric information, or no imposition of inefficient government actions like price controls or taxes. Keeping in mind, if there already is market failure, those government actions could make the market more efficient. But it depends on what our starting point is. Okay, Sweden and Denmark both produce salted cod and automobiles with constant opportunity cost. Sweden will have a comparative advantage in salted cod if the opportunity cost of salted cod production is lower in Sweden than in Denmark. Right? Comparative advantage requires lower opportunity cost. And that's just the definition. Question 20. So the figure shows the domestic market for pants. World price is 30, so the world price is going to be right here. According to the figure, opening up to international trade will lead to a blank in domestic producer surplus and a blank in domestic consumer surplus. Because we don't have to actually do any calculations or think too hard about this. We just have to recognize that because the world price is below the domestic price, this is a country that's going to want to import. Well, when you import, that's good for consumers, that's bad for producers, domestically anyway. And so we're going to expect domestic producer surplus is going to decrease and domestic consumer surplus is going to increase. Question 21. Which of the following statements is correct regarding the way the market allocates output across buyers. So the first one, each buyer is pursuing their own self-interest. Yeah, that's right. Each unit of output goes to the person who'd enjoy it the most. Right. Assuming we have not decoupled willingness to pay and ability to pay. 3, willingness to pay has little impact on the distribution of goods. No, that's incorrect. And 4, there might be unequal distribution of the product across buyers. Yeah, and there almost certainly will, so long as people differ according to willingness to pay. And so the best answer is E, 1, 2, and 4 only. All right, the free rider problem is most common when the good is non-excludable. So non-excludability is basically what we need to allow people to be able to buy non-excludability is what we need for people to be able to consume without buying, which is what's necessary for free riding. When would you see the greatest gain if there's a compensating differential built into your salary? Oh, it's when when you receive a premium that's offsetting some unpleasant aspects of the job that you actually don't care about. Right? So the differential is for a large negative risk that you don't care about as much as most people do. Right? Tariff. So tariff is a tax only on imported products. True. Tax only on exported products. False. Is paid on all units of the good purchased by domestic consumers of the market. False, because 4 is true. Raises the price at which all units of the good may be sold in the market. The tariff is going to raise the price. Now you're going to pay the price as a consumer of the world price plus the tariff, regardless of who you buy from. But if you buy an import, part of that price is going to be the tax, the tariff to the government, and part of the price is going to cover the cost of the foreign seller. If you buy that good from a domestic producer, you're going to pay that same price, but it's all going to go to revenues for that domestic producer. Right? Okay, so 25, what concept would a factory manager use to assign all tasks if they wanted to maximize output and has a fixed amount of resources? Comparative advantage. Opportunity revenues, I am unfamiliar with that term. Absolute advantage is good, but we can get gains from trade assigning according to comparative advantage, and that's how specialization should proceed. So assign production to those with the lowest opportunity cost, especially because we care about scarcity. We have a fixed amount of resources, so we want the tasks to go to whoever gives up the least to perform that task. If a country removes a tariff on imported designer boots, the domestic price of designer boots will likely, and the quantity of designer boots purchased in the domestic market will likely. Okay, so the tariff is bringing the price closer to the domestic equilibrium price. The tariff is limiting the ability of foreign producers to undercut domestic producers. If we remove the tariff, the price is going to fall to the world price, which is going to be lower. And so the domestic price, this isn't the domestic equilibrium price. This means what's the price that you're going to pay for this good in the domestic economy, which becomes the world price when there's free trade, becomes the world price plus the tariff when there's a tariff imposed, and just becomes the domestic equilibrium when there's full protectionism and no free trade. In the labor market for computer programmers, the labor supply curve represents workers who want to sell their labor as programmers, which is just definition of labor supply. Cell phone carriers use cell towers to provide you the service of placing calls and sending messages during normal usage periods. You can place calls at your leisure. During widespread emergency situation, you may not be able to place a call as everyone tries to use the same tower at the same time. Or just when you're walking out of the stadium after a football or basketball game. So during normal periods, cell phone usage is non-rival, but during emergency, it's rival. Because rivalry is assessing one person's usage, the impact of one person's usage on the availability of the good for others. All right, so a firm's demand curve for labor in a perfectly competitive market is the downward sloping portion of its marginal revenue product of labor. Right? So the theory of demand is the theory of marginal benefit. The marginal benefit of hiring a firm hiring a worker in the labor market is the marginal revenue product. The marginal revenue product is multiplying the price of the output good in its market times the marginal product. So what we're interested in is, if I hire one more worker, how much additional stuff are they making for us? And then what's the market value of that stuff? So how much additional stuff are they making for us as marginal product? We multiply that by the market price of that stuff in its own market, which gives us the marginal revenue product, which is the marginal benefit of hiring that additional worker, which gives us our labor demand curve. When everyone produces according to comparative advantage, they gain from trade. This is the brilliance of the division of labor, right? So if we specialize according to comparative advantage, we can produce more stuff than we could have otherwise, because each individual is giving up the least relative to others for making those performing that particular task. So we get the most stuff overall. Let's see. Thomas works 55 hours per week as a legal aid lawyer in the city of Chicago, and his wage is $35 per hour. If the wage increases to $70 per hour, which of these is true? Well, the substitution effect implies he'll work more. Substitution effect says as wage rises, working becomes relatively more attractive, and so substitution effect would say you'd work more. Substitution effect implies you'll work less is just explicitly false. If leisure is a normal good, the income effect implies he'll work more. No, the income effect would have Thomas working less here, because the wage is rising, so would actually value leisure greater. If leisure is a normal good, income effect will reinforce the substitution effect, and he will work more. No, the income effect and substitution effect are two distinct things. And so that's what makes C unnecessarily complicatedly false. All right, so a police officer on an evening shift may earn more than one who works during the day shift because of compensating differentials, which is a premium for tolerating unpleasant working conditions. All right, so you work at Dunkin', and it has several shops around the city, employing several dozen people. When the workers at the city's Starbucks receive a substantial raise, the most likely result regarding Dunkin' is the labor will shift to the left. So importantly, we want to think of labor at Dunkin' as a substitute for labor at Starbucks. And so if you have a wage increase in a related labor market, you'll get workers going into that labor market and leaving the one that they're originally in. So that's why we get Dunkin's labor supply curve shifts to the left, because their workers are going to want to go apply at Starbucks. US and China both produce copper and timber. If China produces copper much more efficiently, absolute advantage, and timber only slightly efficiently, then both countries can benefit even though China holds an absolute advantage of both goods. Yeah, so as long as you don't have the same opportunity costs of producing each good, then somebody will have a comparative advantage, and then you can gain through trade. For decades, the chemical giant DuPont released hazardous chemical from their production in a small town. This caused cancer. They settled a lawsuit. Marginal private cost was $3. Marginal external cost was $1.25. What's the marginal social cost? Society is going to be the cost, the marginal private cost plus the marginal external cost. So society is comprised of the original decision makers and then bystanders. So the cost to the company was 3. The cost to bystanders was 125. The cost overall, social cost, was 425. 36. If Italy levies tariffs on American goods entering Italy, this will tend to benefit Italian producers. Yeah, tariffs benefit domestic producers. Benefit Italian consumers? Nope, tariffs are bad for domestic consumers. Harm American producers? Yes, because American producers are exports. There'll be fewer exports when there's tariffs in the country that they're being imported into. Harm American consumers? No, this is actually good for American consumers, because now there's going to be more products available locally. Because what happens with exports is you bypass the domestic market to take those goods to a foreign consumer who's willing to pay more. If the U.S. increased tariffs on all softwood lumber, domestic blank surplus would blank. So if you increase tariff, that increases domestic producer surplus. So domestic producer surplus would increase. If they produce only sandwiches, in single day, Seraphim can produce 10 sandwiches. Abigail can produce 5 sandwiches. If they make only root beer floats, single day, S can produce 10, A can produce 4. Therefore, S has absolute advantage and a comparative advantage in root beer floats. So let's see. S is more productive in both cases, can produce 10 of each. A can produce only 5 and then 4, respectively. So S definitely has the absolute advantage. And then the comparative advantage is where they give up the least. Where do they give up the least to make root beer floats? So RBF. 10 RBF or 10S, so it's 1 for 1. But for A, it's 4 RBF or 5S. So if I divide through by 4 to get 1 RBF to 5/4 S or 1.25S. Right? So this is just, I always like when I'm calculating comparative advantage or opportunity cost, I always just like directly apply the opportunity cost principle, which is you can do one thing or you can do the other. So I say S could produce 10 RBF or 10S, and then whichever one that I want to frame or take the perspective of to calculate opportunity costs, then I'll divide everything through by whatever is that number. So here I'm just going to divide everything through by 10, which gives me 1 to 1. Here I want to get a 1 RBF to however many S for A as well. And so I'll divide through by 4. 4 over 4 is 1. That's this right here. And then 5 over 4 is 1.25. So that's where that came from. All right, so 39, which of these scenarios illustrates signaling? These are all interesting, but the only one that's signaling is Diego with a PhD in English from Yale, hired as an analyst at Goldman Sachs. No reason to suspect the English PhD itself is at all useful as an analyst, but the degree from Yale signals high ability. And so this is definitely a signaling story. It has to be an unrelated degree, otherwise it'd be a human capital story. So like if Diego had a PhD in finance or computational mathematics or something, or engineering or physics even, right? Then we might tell a human capital story, but because the PhD is in something completely unrelated, but the school presumably carries prestige, then we've got the signal for high ability, which is the signaling story. Every few months, public television asks viewers to contribute to their local PBS station. Although they raise money during that time, it often falls short of the amount that they want to raise. Why? Well, viewers know that they're going to be able to watch public television even if they don't contribute. So they know they're able to free ride. Reason why is there's non-excludability. You can consume without paying. All right, so that concludes the solution walkthrough. I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you next time.